"James, I'm pregnant, but it's not yours." The words hung in the air like a slow-motion car crash. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily could hear the clock ticking on the wall, her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. She had rehearsed this moment over and over in her head, imagined every possible reaction, but nothing could have prepared her for the look in James's eyes. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He didn't even move. He just sat there staring at her with the strangest expression, calm, unreadable. It was almost like he had expected this. Emily swallowed hard, her mouth dry as sandpaper. "James, please say something." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You're pregnant," he repeated, his voice eerily even. "But it's not mine." She nodded, her fingers trembling against the fabric of her dress. She started, but the words caught in her throat. What was she even supposed to say? That she was sorry, that it was a mistake, that she never meant for this to happen? All of it sounded hollow now. James tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "That's interesting," Emily blinked. "That's interesting." That was his response. No rage, no questions, no accusations. Just that. She had expected anger. She had braced herself for him to stand up, to demand to know who the father was, to throw things, to curse her name. But this was something entirely different. And somehow it was worse. "You're not..." She hesitated. "You're not mad?" James let out a quiet chuckle. "Oh, I'm furious," he said almost casually. "But that's not the only thing I'm feeling right now." He laced his fingers together and rested his chin on them. "You want to hear something funny?" Emily's stomach twisted. This wasn't the reaction she was expecting. This wasn't normal. "James," she said cautiously, "what's going on?" His lips curved into a small, almost amused smile. "I have a confession too." Her breath hitched. This wasn't how this conversation was supposed to go. She had spent weeks working up the courage to tell him, to face the consequences of what she had done. She had expected the worst: tears, fights, maybe even a complete breakdown of their marriage. But she hadn't expected this. James was still looking at her, waiting for her to respond, but what was she supposed to say? Finally, she forced herself to speak. "A confession?" Her voice wavered. "What do you mean?" James leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. His wedding band gleamed under the dim kitchen light, and for a brief moment, Emily felt a pang of guilt so sharp it made her stomach churn. She had betrayed him. She had shattered everything they had built. And yet, why did it feel like he wasn't as broken as he should be? "Before I say anything," James murmured, "I have to ask, why are you telling me this now?" Emily's chest tightened. "Because you deserve to know the truth." James nodded slowly, considering her words. Then he smiled again, but this time it wasn't amused. It was something else, something darker. "Well," he said, his voice almost teasing, "if we're being honest with each other, then I guess it's my turn." Emily's blood turned to ice. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She could barely breathe as James leaned back in his chair, an unreadable expression on his face. His eyes didn't hold the shock she had expected, nor the heartbreak. He looked at her, his fingers drumming lightly against the table, a slow, almost deliberate rhythm. "You're pregnant," he repeated, his voice eerily calm. "But it's not mine." A lump formed in her throat. She had prepared for screaming, accusations, maybe even rage, but not this. His silence was suffocating, his composure unsettling. "James, please, say something." He exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly as if studying her. Then, to her horror, he smirked. "That's interesting." Emily's hands clenched into fists. What kind of response was that? "That's interesting." No pain, no anger, no disbelief. It didn't make sense. She swallowed hard. I never meant for this to happen. James raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening just slightly. Didn't you? Her breath caught in her throat. You don't seem too surprised, she whispered. Why aren't you angry? He finished for her. Oh, Emily, you think this is the first time you've broken something between us? Her stomach turned to ice. What do you mean? James leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. I have a confession too, he said, his tone almost teasing. Emily's chest tightened. What? Her voice was barely above a whisper. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You're pregnant with another man's child. He paused for a second before continuing. But I've had my own secret too. I've been cheating on you. The world tilted. Emily felt her entire body go numb. What? His expression didn't change. For over a year. Her pulse roared in her ears. You're lying, she said automatically. James let out a short, humourless laugh. Am I? Her hands shook as she pushed back from the table. No, this wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was the one confessing. She was the one who had made a mistake. But James, not him. He had always been the steady one, the reliable one. You're just saying this to hurt me, she whispered. His eyes darkened. You don't get to play the victim, Emily. Her breathing was uneven, shallow. Who? For the first time his expression shifted, just slightly. Do you really want to know? Her stomach twisted. The way he asked the question sent a chill down her spine. Yes. He studied her for a moment, then sighed. It's someone you know. The blood drained from her face. No. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. Who? James didn't break eye contact. Sarah. Her heart stopped. Everything around her faded. The walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath her feet. It all blurred into nothingness. Sarah, her best friend, the woman she trusted with everything. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. James watched her reaction carefully, his gaze unflinching. Now you know how it feels. Emily's stomach twisted violently. Her mind raced, trying to piece everything together. Sarah. How could she not have seen it? How long? Her voice was barely audible. James leaned back again, his expression unreadable. A little over a year. A year. Sarah had been in her life every day, smiling, laughing, acting like nothing was wrong. Bile rose in Emily's throat. She felt sick. You're lying, she choked out. James simply raised an eyebrow. Am I? Her mind flashed through the past. The nights James had come home late, the times Sarah had suddenly cancelled plans, the looks exchanged between them that she had never questioned before. It had all been there. Hiding in plain sight. She had thought she was the one destroying her marriage. She had thought she was the only one carrying a secret. But James, he had been one step ahead of her the whole time. And now she wasn't sure who had betrayed who first. You've been lying to me this whole time. Emily's voice cracked as she shoved herself up from the chair, her pulse hammering against her ribs. James didn't flinch. He sat there, arms crossed, watching her unravel. His expression was infuriatingly calm, like he had been waiting for this exact reaction. What about you? His voice was sharp, controlled. You're pregnant with another man's baby. The words sliced through her. Her stomach clenched, her hands trembling as she tried to find something, anything to throw back at him. That's not the same, she shot back. I made a mistake, but at least I told you the truth. You, she pointed a shaking finger at him, you lied for over a year. You looked me in the eyes every day, slept next to me every night, and kept this from me. How could you do that? James exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You think you're the only one who felt neglected? The only one who felt invisible? He let out a bitter laugh. Emily, do you even realise how long I waited for you to notice me? To see me? She blinked. What are you talking about? You were always distant, he muttered, rubbing his temples. Even before you cheated, you were never really there. It was always your job, your friends, your plans, everything but us. Emily's throat tightened. That's not true. James looked up, his eyes burning. Really? When was the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not out of obligation, but because you actually cared. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. He scoffed, shaking his head. That's what I thought. That doesn't excuse what you did, she snapped, desperation creeping into her voice. Sarah was my best friend, James. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? Do you have any idea what it felt like for me to realise I didn't matter to you anymore? His voice was rising now, a rare crack in his usual composure. Sarah was there when you weren't. She listened when you brushed me off. I didn't go looking for it, Emily. It just happened. Her chest ached with fury. That's such bullshit. People don't just accidentally cheat. James shot up from his seat, closing the distance between them in 2 steps. And what about you? He fired back. You think what you did was different? She sucked in a sharp breath. I was lonely, she whispered, her voice small. You never what? His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Never fought for you, never chased after you every time you pulled away, never got jealous enough, never controlled you enough, never begged you to stay? His jaw tightened. I trusted you, Emily. I loved you. But that wasn't enough for you, was it? Tears welled up in her eyes. That's not fair, James let out a humourless laugh. None of this is fair. The room was thick with tension, both of them staring at each other as if the other was a stranger. Emily wiped at her face, shaking her head. So what now? We just destroy each other with every mistake we've made? Keep score until there's nothing left? James's shoulders slumped, exhaustion seeping into his expression. We've already done that. She pressed her hands to her temples, the weight of everything crushing down on her. I never wanted this, she whispered. He sighed, rubbing his face. Neither did I. Silence stretched between them, not the quiet, comfortable kind they used to share. This was something else, something hollow, broken. Emily finally looked up at him, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. But for the first time, she couldn't find it. And maybe, just maybe, it had been gone for a long time. Emily's breathing was uneven, her hands shaking as she stared at James. Who is she? The words barely made it out, her voice raw from everything that had already been said. James looked away, his jaw clenching. That was all she needed to see. He had hesitated. He was thinking about how to answer. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't just some random woman. A lump formed in her throat. Who is she, James? He exhaled through his nose, still refusing to look at her. The room felt too small, the air too heavy. A deep, sick feeling crept over her. She took a step closer, her pulse hammering in her ears. Tell me the truth. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, and in that moment, she knew. She shook her head, taking a step back as nausea rolled through her. No. James's expression hardened, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It's Sarah, isn't it? James shut his eyes, pressing his fingers to his temple like he was bracing for impact. The floor beneath Emily felt like it was crumbling. Sarah, the one person she had trusted with everything. The one person she had cried to, vented to, about him. Sarah had been there through it all, nodding along, telling her she deserved better, that she deserved to feel wanted. The betrayal slammed into her like a freight train. her best friend, her husband. How long? Her voice trembled, but there was no stopping now. How long, James? James's eyes opened, but they were empty. A little over a year. A year, Emily stumbled back, gripping the edge of the table to keep herself upright. Sarah had been in her home, at her dinner table, at every birthday and holiday. Every single moment she had been there, pretending. Her stomach churned. She had been so blind. James exhaled sharply. "You're not the only one who felt unwanted, Emily." Her eyes snapped to him, fury bubbling up in her chest. "So that makes it okay?" His gaze was cold. "Didn't you justify what you did by saying you were lonely?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips, but it felt hollow. "You're really standing there trying to make this equal?" James didn't answer. Emily's hands clenched into fists. "I trusted her, James." Her voice cracked. "She was my best friend." "I trusted you," he shot back. "You were my wife." A sharp pain stabbed through her chest. Her best friend, her husband, the two people she thought she could count on the most. She swallowed back the bile rising in her throat. "Was it love?" The words burned coming out. James didn't respond right away. That was all the answer she needed. Her knees felt weak. "Oh my God!" James ran a hand through his hair, looking away. "It doesn't matter." Emily let out a shaky breath. "Doesn't matter." Her voice was rising now, anger mixing with the heartbreak. "I'm carrying another man's child, and you've been sleeping with my best friend for a year, and you're standing there telling me it doesn't matter." James's eyes snapped back to her, his jaw tightening. "What do you want me to say, Emily? That I regret it? That I hate myself? That I wish I could take it back?" His voice lowered, dangerously calm. "Would that make you feel better?" Tears burned at the edges of her eyes. "It would make me feel like I wasn't completely alone in this." James exhaled slowly. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then he looked at her, his voice quieter now. "Who's the father?" The question sent an icy shock through her veins. She hadn't told him, not yet. James was watching her carefully now, his gaze unreadable. Her pulse raced. "Who is he?" His voice was calmer this time, more deliberate. Emily's stomach twisted into knots. The truth sat heavy on her tongue, threatening to break free. She could lie. She could make this easier. But after everything that had just come out, lies weren't an option anymore. Her breath came out uneven. Her hands clenched. Her chest ached. And then she said it. Emily's lips parted, but the words felt stuck in her throat. Her hands trembled at her sides, her entire body frozen under the weight of what she was about to say. James's eyes bore into hers, unblinking, his patience unravelling with every passing second. "Say it," he demanded, his voice sharp, controlled, but edged with something dangerous. "Who is he?" Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might be sick. The words clawed at her, threatening to choke her, to bury her alive in the moment. She could lie. She could make it easier. She could say it was a stranger, someone irrelevant, someone who wouldn't destroy whatever was left between them. But she couldn't. Not now. Not after everything. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her dress, gripping it like it was the only thing holding her together. Her breath came out uneven. "It's Matt." The air in the room shifted, heavy, suffocating. James didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared. The silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. Emily could feel the walls closing in, her skin burning under the weight of his gaze. Then he let out a breath. A slow, sharp exhale through his nose. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. His chest rose and fell with steady, measured breaths, like he was forcing himself to stay in control. "My brother." His voice was quiet, but the undercurrent of rage was undeniable. "My brother?" Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. James took a step back, running a hand over his face. A bitter, humourless laugh escaped his lips. "Wow!" He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You really outdid yourself, Emily." "James? No." His voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. "Don't! Just don't!" She reached out, but he flinched away like her touch would burn him. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. I was drunk. I was upset. Oh, of course you were." He let out another bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think that makes it better? You think that changes what you did?" Emily's chest ached. "I wasn't thinking." James's eyes snapped to hers, blazing with fury. "No, you were thinking. You were thinking about how miserable you were, how unloved you felt, how much you wanted someone to give a damn about you. And my brother was just there, right?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "Tell me, Emily, did you even hesitate?" Tears burned at the back of her eyes. "Of course I did." James clenched his jaw, looking away. His shoulders rose and fell with every uneven breath. "How long?" Emily's throat was dry. "What?" His gaze snapped back to hers, sharper now, darker. "How long? Was it just one night, or was it—" He swallowed, shaking his head. "Forget it. I don't even want to know." Emily bit her lip, forcing back the sob building in her chest. "It was just once, James." His laughter was hollow. "And that's supposed to make me feel better?" She shook her head. "No." Silence. James dragged a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. He looked away, his jaw clenched so tight she thought it might break. Then, without another word, he turned toward the door. Panic surged through her. "James!" He didn't stop. "Please!" He reached for the doorknob, his movements rigid, mechanical. Tears spilled down her cheeks as her voice cracked. "Don't leave." James paused, his back still to her. His hand rested on the doorknob, his shoulders rising and falling with every breath. For a second she thought he might stay, but then he pulled the door open and walked out. Emily sat on the cold kitchen floor, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the empty space where James used to stand. The silence in the apartment was deafening. She had called him, texted, left voicemails, but there was nothing, no response, no sign of him. It had been days he was really gone. Her worst fear had come true. She reached for her phone again, scrolling through their old messages, rereading the way he used to text her. "Did you eat? Be safe. I love you." Simple things that once felt routine now felt like a knife to the chest. The last message he had sent before everything fell apart was still there, untouched. "Let's talk when I get home." But he never came home. A sharp knock at the door made her flinch. For a moment, hope flickered in her chest. Maybe James had changed his mind. Maybe he was willing to listen. Maybe... She yanked the door open. It was Sarah. Emily's stomach twisted into a painful knot. Sarah looked nervous, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Hey." Her voice was quiet, careful. "Can we talk?" Emily could barely breathe. The sight of Sarah standing there, looking guilty, looking worried, it made her want to scream. She gripped the doorframe, her nails digging into the wood. "You have some nerve showing up here," Sarah sighed. "Emily!" "No." Her voice cracked. "I don't want to hear it." Sarah's eyes glistened with something that almost looked like regret. Almost. "I never meant for this to happen." Emily let out a hollow laugh. "That's what James said too. That's what I said. You think that makes it okay?" Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. Emily shook her head, her breath shaky. "I trusted you. I told you things I never even told James. And the whole time you were sleeping with him." Sarah's face crumpled. It wasn't like that. Emily's fingers clenched into fists. Then what was it? Sarah looked away, shame flickering across her face. I don't know. Emily's throat burned. Just go. Sarah hesitated for a moment like she wanted to say something else, but then she turned and walked away. Emily slammed the door shut behind her, her hands shaking as she pressed her forehead against the wood. One more person gone. She sank back onto the floor, wrapping her arms around herself. She had lost James. She had lost Sarah. And now there was only one person left to face. Matthew, the baby's father. Her hands shook as she dialed his number. The phone rang twice before he picked up. What do you want? His voice was cold. Emily swallowed hard. We need to talk. A long silence. Then, yeah, we do. 30 minutes later, he was at her door. Matt stood there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. So, he exhaled sharply. What now? Emily felt her stomach twist. I don't know. Matt let out a short, humourless laugh. Figures. She hesitated. Are you going to be involved? Matt's jaw tightened. I'll support the baby, but that's it. Her chest ached. You don't have to do this alone. Matt's eyes flashed with something sharp. Neither did you. Emily looked away, shame washing over her. Matt shook his head. I never wanted to be a part of this mess. I never wanted to hurt anyone. And now look where we are. She swallowed back the lump in her throat. I didn't mean for this to happen. Matt let out a tired sigh. Yeah, seems to be the theme, doesn't it? Silence stretched between them. Finally, he took a step back. I'll be there for the baby, but not for you. And then, just like James, he turned and walked away. Emily closed the door behind him, her hands trembling. One mistake, one night, and she had lost everything. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers twisted together so tightly that her knuckles were white. She hadn't slept in days, and the exhaustion was evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. The apartment felt empty without James, without his presence filling the space. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime, waiting for the inevitable. The door creaked open, and her breath hitched. James stepped inside, his face unreadable, his eyes tired but firm. He looked different, colder, distant. He didn't belong here anymore. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You came back. He nodded slowly, his expression stiff. To get the rest of my things. His gaze flickered to the packed boxes near the door. And to talk. Emily's heart clenched. Talk about what? James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. The divorce. The words sliced through her like a blade. She shook her head. No. James's jaw tightened. Emily, no. Her voice cracked as she stood up, her chest rising and falling rapidly. We can fix this. We can go to therapy. There's nothing left to fix. She froze. James's voice was firm but not angry, just tired. We've both done things we can't take back, he continued. We hurt each other. We let things fall apart. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. And I can't keep doing this. I can't stay in something that's already broken. Emily's eyes burned with unshed tears. But I love you? James let out a quiet breath. I loved you too. Her chest ached at the past tense. She reached for his hand, but he stepped back. The space between them had never felt wider. Please, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But James looked at her, and for the first time there was no anger, no bitterness, just finality. You didn't just hurt me, he said quietly. You lost me. Emily's breath hitched. She had always assumed there would be time to make things right, that no matter how bad things got, they would find a way back to each other. But now she realized he was already gone. He bent down, lifting the last of his things. Sarah's out of the picture, if it matters, he muttered. She and I were never meant to last. Emily let out a hollow laugh, swiping at her face. That makes two of us, then. James looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment she wondered if he felt it too, the ache, the regret, the what-ifs. He shifted the bag over his shoulder and moved toward the door. He hesitated for just a second before turning back one last time. I hope your baby brings you the happiness you couldn't find with me. Her lips parted, but before she could say anything, he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and with it, so did everything they had built. Emily sank onto the couch, staring at the empty space where he had stood. For so long she had convinced herself that she was the victim, that she was the one who had been left behind, ignored, forgotten. But now, for the first time, she saw the truth. They had both destroyed this marriage. Maybe it had been unravelling long before the affairs, before the confessions, before the lies. Maybe they had been doomed from the moment they started wanting things the other couldn't give. She wiped at her face, taking a shaky breath. She wasn't sure what the future looked like anymore, but for the first time she knew one thing. She had to start over.